The town of Dry Creek lay at the edge of the desert like a stubborn memory, a cluster of wooden buildings held together by dust and grit, where whispers traveled faster than the stagecoaches that rattled through once a week. And it was into this town that Clara Morgan arrived one blistering afternoon, her boots worn thin, her dress clinging to her from the long road behind her, and in her hand a small satchel that carried everything she owned, which wasn't much at all. And her eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, carried the look of someone who had walked too many miles, with too little rest, but still refused to bow to despair, for Clara had left behind a life broken by poverty, loss, and betrayal. And now she sought something simple, something honest work, a chance to earn her keep and survive. But in a town like Dry Creek, women without family or coin weren't seen as much more than burdens or entertainment. And so the stares she drew as she walked the main street were sharp, heavy, some curious, others cruel, but she ignored them, her chin lifted, until she reached the edge of town where the land opened wide into rolling plains and endless sky. And there stood a ranch called a ranch. Folks called it the pride of Dry Creek, sprawling with cattle, horses, and acres of hard earth wrestled into productivity by the hands of one man, James Calder, a cowboy whose name carried weight in every saloon and general store for miles, a man whose past was whispered of in fragments. Some said he'd once been an outlaw, others swore he'd ridden with rangers, some believed he'd killed men in duels and left behind a fortune, but all agreed on one thing: James Calder was not a man to cross, and his ranch thrived because he demanded of others the same relentless work he gave himself. And it was toward this ranch Clara walked, the sun biting into her shoulders, her throat dry, but her spirit stubborn, for she had no other choice. And when she reached the wooden gate, she saw him, leaning against the fence rail, tall, broad, his hat shadowing eyes that seemed to see further than most, his jaw set like stone, his presence one of command and solitude, as though he belonged to no one but the land itself. And Clara, gathering her courage, stepped forward and spoke, her voice trembling but strong. "Sir, I came to ask if you have work for me. I'll do anything: cook, clean, tend the horses, mend fences, whatever you need. I'll do it." And James, who had been studying her from the moment she appeared on the horizon, didn't answer right away, instead letting the silence stretch long enough to make Clara's heart pound against her ribs. And then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "I've got work, miss, but only on one condition." And Clara, desperate, nodded quickly. "Anything, sir, name it," she said, hope flickering in her chest. But James's eyes held hers like steel, and he replied, calm and unflinching, "Only if you'll marry me by sunset." And the words struck Clara like a sudden thunderclap in the silence of the plains, so strange and impossible that for a moment she thought she had misheard him. But his face carried no hint of jest, and she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "Marry you by sunset? You don't even know me." And James tilted his head, the shadow of his hat hiding his eyes, but his voice steady. "I know enough to see you're not the kind that breaks easy, enough to see you've walked through fire to get here, and enough to know I need someone who'll stand beside me, not behind me. And I don't make bargains that linger, miss. So if it's yes, it's by sunset." And Clara felt her knees weaken, her breath catching in her chest, because she had come here seeking work, not a proposal. And yet here was a man offering not pity but a choice, strange and sudden as it was. And the day stretched out before her like a test of fate, for James didn't press her, didn't plead or threaten. He simply went about his work, mending fences, tending cattle, riding out across his land. And Clara followed, unsure why, perhaps to prove to herself she wasn't afraid, perhaps because something about his words had unsettled her heart in ways she couldn't explain. And as the hours passed, she saw him not as the whispered legend the town had painted, but as a man carved by labor, his hands rough from rope and reins, his face marked by sun and years, his silence carrying both loneliness and strength. And she found herself watching the way he treated his horses with patience, the way he handled his men with fairness, the way he spoke few words but each one carried weight. And though she tried to convince herself he was mad, that this was some trap or cruel jest, she couldn't ignore the strange pull in her chest, the way he looked at her not like she was fragile or desperate, but like she was capable, like he already saw her as an equal. And when at last the sun began its slow descent, spilling fire across the sky, Clara found herself standing with him again at the corral, her heart pounding, her satchel at her feet, the moment upon her, and James, his voice as steady as it had been that morning, said, "The day's nearly gone, Clara. What's your answer?" And she, trembling but unbroken, whispered, "Why me? You could have any woman in town. Why? Choose me, a stranger?" And for the first time his jaw softened, his eyes revealing a flicker of something vulnerable. And he answered, "Because you came to me asking for work, not for mercy. Because you carry yourself with pride even when you've got nothing. Because when I look at you I don't see weakness, I see fire. And that's the kind of partner this life demands." And Clara's throat tightened, because no one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her as more than a burden. And she realized that his condition, as strange as it seemed, wasn't about possession but about urgency, about a man who understood the land, the storms, the way time could strip everything away if you waited too long. And in that moment she understood too, and though fear whispered that she was leaping into the unknown, her heart, battered but yearning, whispered back that perhaps this was the chance she had been waiting for. And so, as the last edge of sun sank into the horizon, Clara lifted her chin, stepped closer, and said, yes, the word trembling but resolute, and James, for the first time, allowed a shadow of a smile to touch his lips, and he reached for her hand, calloused against her delicate skin, and said, "Then by sunset, you're mine, and I'm yours." And in that moment, beneath a sky ablaze with twilight, two souls who had carried their burdens alone found in each other not perfection, but partnership, not romance dressed in lace and roses, but something fiercer, something truer, an alliance forged in fire and choice. And that night, the town of Dry Creek buzzed with whispers of the cowboy who wed the stranger by sunset. But Clara, as she stood beside James, knew she had not been chosen out of desperation or pity, but out of recognition, and that was worth more than gold. And dear friend, if this tale of grit, fire, and unexpected love stirred your heart, if it reminded you that sometimes the greatest stories are born not from fairy tales but from choices made in the hardest places, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because there are more tales of the Old West waiting for you, stories where courage meets destiny, and love is found in the most unlikely of bargains. Asterisk.